The hollow oak. The ledger burned blue, and when the last page turned to ash, Mikhail watched his own face smooth over in the darkness. Eyes vanishing, mouth sealing shut, skin becoming blank and featureless, like the 12 figures that had circled him moments before. The village had swallowed him whole. 50 years earlier, lightning had revealed everything. Heavy leather boots splashed into a puddle that reached his ankle. The water was thick, more mud than liquid, and it dragged at Mikhail's heel. Rain lashed sideways, turning his gray wool coat charcoal black. The wind came in gusts, each one shoving his shoulder, forcing him to lean into it. His eyes were slitted against the silver needles falling from above. The sky was bruised violet where it touched the earth, and there, a jagged bolt of white tore everything apart. The crack came not a second later, instantaneous, the thunder like a bone breaking in his own ribs. Ivan grabbed his shoulder. His fingers dug into the wet wool, and he was pointing, his whole arm shaking, toward the massive girth of the great oak, that ancient thing that had stood in the village center for longer than anyone could calculate. Wider than a man, was tall, bark like scales. Mikhail saw it then, lightning descending, a finger of pure white reaching down from the torn sky. It struck the crown of the tree, and a massive limb cracked free, swinging down like a scythe. The motion was slow, terrible, and Mikhail's body moved without permission from his mind. He dived left, rolling through slick mud and dead leaves, his palms scraping against stone. Behind him, the limb crashed down where he'd been standing. The wood exploded into sparks, searing orange light against the rain, a smell of burning bark and ozone. When Mikhail scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short, painful gasps, Ivan was standing by the fresh scar in the trunk. A rectangular cavity had opened where the branch tore away. Ivan's hand was already reaching into it, his fingers disappearing into the darkness inside the tree. He pulled out a bundle. The wrapping was deer hide, rotted and oil-slicked, falling apart in his hands. Beneath it, something else. Something old, a ledger. The cover was dark brown leather, brittle with age, and embossed across its front was a symbol, a single eye, weeping. The tears carved deep into the leather, deliberate and precise. Mikhail stood over Ivan, his shirt soaked through, his breathing still ragged. The smoke rising from the lightning-burned bark swirled between them. Ivan whispered without looking up. "This wasn't placed here to be found, Mikhail." The kitchen was small, the walls stained with years of smoke from the stove. An oil lamp flickered on the rough-hewn pine table, casting shadows that danced across Ivan's face. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind had died. In that new quiet, the sound of turning pages seemed impossibly loud. Ivan sat across from him, his hand steady now, turning the brittle parchment with care. Each page was so thin it was nearly transparent, and beneath the fibers Mikhail could see earlier, writing bleeding through, charcoal symbols layered over centuries. Ivan traced a name with his thumb. The name Petrov was written in reddish ink, the kind that looked almost like dried blood. A line connected it to another name, Volkov. Black ink. A Pact. Mikhail leaned over Ivan's shoulder and read the text aloud. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, foreign and distant. The words were archaic, written in a script that predated anything he recognized from the village records. One soul for the harvest, one blood for the soil. Every third generation, the debt is called. The wind picked up again outside, howling through the chimney. It came down into the kitchen and made the lamp flicker. And for a moment, the shadows on Ivan's face seemed to sharpen, to deepen, to become something other than shadows. Ivan turned another page. His movements had become mechanical, jerky. This page was different. At the top, a list of dates. Mikhail's eyes locked onto the last entry. 1924, 1974, 2024. Below the dates, two names written in fresh ink, so fresh it looked wet. Ivan and Mikhail. Mikhail leaned back. The chair scraped against the floor. His mouth had gone dry. "This is a joke," he heard himself say. "Someone put this here to find. It's a trick." But Ivan didn't respond. He was staring at the bottom of the page where a sketch had been drawn, a map of their village as seen from above. And there, circled in red, was Ivan's house. Next to it, the notation, "The first offering." Ivan's hand trembled. He slammed the book shut, and a dust cloud erupted from the pages, swirling in the lamplight like something alive. When it settled, he looked at Mikhail, and his eyes had changed. The color of his irises seemed to have deepened, or perhaps it was only the lamp casting everything in amber. But the expression was new. It was sharp. It was edged with something that looked like mistrust. The porch was wet. Water dripped from the gutters in a steady rhythm, one drop every 3 seconds, hitting the wooden planks below. Mikhail stood in the doorway, the ledger tucked under his coat, pressed against his ribs. The fog was rolling in low, between the barn and the house, obscuring everything below chest height. The shadows moved against the barn wall, long, impossible shapes that didn't align with any trees or posts that could be seen. They were too tall. They were too thin. They moved with a coordination that suggested intention. Mikhail's hand went to the doorframe. His fingers found the old wood, familiar and worn. His other hand gripped the ledger tighter. Then the figure lunged from the fog. It moved faster than anything should move, a shape in an ash-gray cloak that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The impact drove Mikhail backward, his back slamming against the porch railing. The wood groaned, a long, creaking sound of stress. Mikhail's fist shot forward, connecting with what felt like frozen leather stretched over stone. The attacker wheezed, a dry, rattling sound that came from nowhere, a human mouth should be. And Mikhail kicked outward. His boot connected with the figure's midsection, and it flew backward, the gray cloak swirling around it like smoke. But there was no face. Where there should have been a face, there was only smooth skin, pale, featureless, like a doll that had been left unfinished. The blade appeared before Mikhail registered that the figure held it. Long and thin and silver, it cut through the air with a whistling sound, and Mikhail rolled to his right. The blade sliced through the porch pillar behind him, shearing off a chunk of wood the size of his fist. The sound was like a razor cutting leather. A frost trail hung in the air where the blade had passed. Mikhail's hand found the iron lantern that hung by the door. He'd grabbed it 100 times in his life, never thinking twice about it. Now his fingers closed around its handle, and he swung it in a wide arc. The momentum came from his whole body, all the fear and adrenaline and primal instinct pouring into the motion. It connected. The sound was a heavy, dull thud, and the lantern shattered. Oil ignited instantly, and for a fraction of a second, the porch was flooded with light. In that light, Mikhail saw the face. It wasn't a face. It was a mask of skin with no features at all. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, blank flesh. And then the fire consumed it. And the figure fell backward, and Mikhail ran into the house and slammed the door behind him. Outside, the only sound was the crackle of burning oil cooling in the rain. The well was deep, and the rope was wet. Ivan's hands gripped it with a ferocity that turned his knuckles white. When he saw Mikhail coming through the fog, he didn't let go. He just stopped moving, the bucket suspended halfway up the shaft, water dripping from it in a steady rhythm. The fog was heavy here, so thick it obscured everything below the waist. Ivan's legs seemed to end at nothing. He pulled a locket from his pocket. Brass, tarnished almost to black. He snapped it open with a small, deliberate gesture. Inside was a newspaper clipping. The edges were yellowed, and the text was faded, but the headline was clear. Village Elder Dies in Fall. The date was 1974. Below the clipping, someone had written a note in precise handwriting. Mikhail couldn't read it from where he stood, so he stepped closer. Ivan's eyes were bloodshot. There were dark circles beneath them, and his skin had a grayish cast, like he hadn't slept in days. He held the locket toward Mikhail, showing him the back of the clipping, a burial permit, signed. The cause of death had been crossed out. Someone had rewritten it in different ink, or perhaps the same ink, but written at a different time. The signature at the bottom was his grandfather's. A. Volkov. Below the signature, the words, "Death by offering, acceptance of the contract." Ivan's voice was cold when he spoke. Flat, like something essential had been stripped away, and what remained was only function. Your grandfather didn't bury him, Mikhail. He offered him. To the tree. Mikhail's heel caught on one of the stones that ringed the well. He stumbled backward, his arms coming up to steady himself. When he looked at his hands, they seemed foreign to him, like they belonged to someone else entirely. In this light, they almost looked like they were stained. The fog seemed to pulse with a low rhythmic sound. A heartbeat. Not his own. He could feel his heart hammering in his throat. But something deeper. Something that came from beneath the earth itself. The stones vibrated with it. Thump, thump, thump. Ivan leaned in closer. His face was inches away now, his eyes strangely unfocused, his pupils elongated like a cat's. His breath smelled of copper. He reached out and grabbed Mikhail's collar, pulling him closer. The wool was still damp from the previous night's rain. Every 50 years, Ivan said, his voice barely audible. Every 50 years, one of us feeds the tree. It's written in the ledger. It's always been written. Your grandfather fed mine. Now. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The truck was old and starting to fail. The engine had been making a sound like a dying animal for the past 6 months, and now it was worse. It knocked and struggled as Mikhail pushed the accelerator down, sending the vehicle careening down the dirt road in a cloud of gray dust. The fuel gauge was erratic, the needle swinging back and forth across the empty marker like it was confused about its own purpose. The road stretched ahead, dirt and gravel and occasional patches of worn asphalt leading away from the village toward the main highway, toward escape. Then the road ended. A wall of tree roots erupted from the ground, twisted and massive, 20 feet high at least, blocking the entire path. The roots were as thick as a man's torso, and they writhed slightly, shifting with a sound like grinding stone. Mikhail slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screaming against the gravel, and came to a stop 5 feet from the barrier. He sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the roots move. They had to be moving. They had to be. Because the alternative, that they were still and he was simply seeing what he expected to see, was worse somehow. The truck doors were yanked open, both of them simultaneously. Hands reached in, gray-gloved hands, pale and too long, and pulled him from the cab. His head slammed into the mud, and his vision swam. He could taste blood. He could see boots standing over him. Featureless figures, 2 of them, and there might have been more. His hand found something cold and metallic in the mud. The tire iron. He swung it in a wide arc, connecting with something that felt like frozen wood. The sound was like snapping a branch. Black liquid, not blood, something thicker, something that looked like tree sap, splattered across his face. He scrambled backward toward the truck, pulling himself up, his legs slipping in the mud. More figures were emerging from the root wall now, stepping out of it like it was a doorway. He threw himself into the cab and grabbed the gear shifter. Reverse, hard. The truck lurched backward, the engine grinding with a sound like metal tearing. The gearbox protested, but it caught, and the vehicle shot backward, tires spinning. In the rearview mirror, Mikhail could see the figures reaching for him, could see more shapes emerging from between the roots, and behind them, the roots themselves beginning to close the gap, to shift back together, to seal the exit. The truck picked up speed. Mikhail's hands were shaking so badly he could barely control the wheel. The road behind him twisted. He wasn't sure if it was the motion or his vision. And then there was the sound of branches snapping, and the truck was back on the main road, racing toward the village, toward the only place he knew. The cedar chest was old, made from wood that had been treated with oil and resin decades ago. Mikhail tore the lid open, and dust motes exploded upward, catching the late afternoon light that slanted through the attic window. The dust hung in the air, suspended, reluctant to settle. Inside the chest were baby clothes, tiny shirts and trousers yellowed with age, and underneath them, a stack of Polaroid photographs. Mikhail pulled them out with trembling fingers. The edges of the photographs were white, the way they had been in the 80s and 90s, and the images had begun to fade, the colors shifting toward a weird, antiseptic palette. He found the one he was looking for by instinct. The date was printed on the bottom in faded black ink. The binding, 1989. It showed two babies being held by their mothers. Mikhail knew them, his own mother and Ivan's mother, both younger than he'd ever seen them, their faces soft with maternal something, their eyes half closed. Behind them, standing by the great oak, were their fathers, his grandfather, Ivan's father, and both of them had their hands pressed against the bark of the tree. Blood ran from their palms, staining the wood, running down the trunk in dark rivulets. But there was something else in the photograph, a shadow behind the mothers. Mikhail leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. It was a figure, tall and featureless, wearing clothes that didn't match the era of the photo. The clothes looked modern, recent, and it was pointing directly at the camera. Mikhail dropped the photograph. It landed on the ledger, which he'd brought up to the attic with him, unable to let it out of his sight. The impact was soft, the tick of paper on paper, but it seemed to echo in the small space. He picked up the ledger with shaking hands and opened it to the last page, the one he thought he'd already read. There was handwriting there, fresh handwriting. And with growing horror, Mikhail recognized it as his own. The formation of the letters, the particular way he wrote his M's, the slight rightward slant. He didn't remember writing it, but there it was. I accept my role as the keeper. The ink looked wet. When he touched it, his finger came away clean. It dried instantly in the air, but for a moment it had been damp. The words began to blur, and Mikhail realized his vision was swimming. His breath came in short gasps. The attic suddenly seemed very small, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move with intention. The greenhouse was hot and humid, the air thick with the smell of earth and growing things. Ferns hung from the ceiling on chains, their fronds brushing against his face as he pushed through them. The glass panes were fogged with condensation, and beyond them, the purple twilight had begun to dissolve into full darkness. Ivan stood in the center of the space, his silhouette framed against the glowing glass. He held a garden spade, a heavy one, the kind meant for serious work. His shadow loomed over Mikhail as he stepped forward. The condensation on the glass made everything look like it was underwater, dreamlike and distorted. Ivan swung the spade. Mikhail ducked, and the heavy metal blade shattered a row of terracotta pots, sending dirt and clay shards exploding across the floor in a shower of debris. Mikhail tackled him. They crashed through a glass shelf, the panes shattering into diamonds as they fell. They landed hard on the concrete floor, the impact driving the breath from Mikhail's lungs. They grappled, hands searching for purchase on wet skin and damp clothes. Ivan was strong, stronger than he should have been. His forearm pressed into Mikhail's throat, and Mikhail's vision began to darken at the edges. His fingers scrabbled across the floor, searching, finding a shard of glass sharp enough to cut. When Ivan leaned in closer, whispering something Mikhail couldn't hear over the roaring in his ears, the forearm didn't release its pressure. Instead, Ivan's other hand grabbed Mikhail's jaw, forcing his head back, exposing his throat. "You are the one who marked my father," Ivan whispered. His breath was cold. "The ledger shows your hand." Ivan pulled his sleeve up. In the dim light, Mikhail could see his arm was covered with a symbol. The same weeping eye from the ledger cover, repeated over and over again, tattooed into his skin in sickly green ink that seemed to glow with its own faint light. "Every third generation," Ivan continued, "the debt collector comes. And this time, it came for both of us. But only one of us can be the keeper. Only one of us can control the next cycle." He smiled, and his teeth were too white in the darkness. "I won't let it be you." Mikhail ran. His lungs burned, his legs pumping, his bare feet slapping against the cobblestones. The village square opened before him, and he made for the gate, the way out, the only possibility that remained. The fog was black now. It had been white, then gray, and now it was the color of tar, the color of ink, the color of the sky before a storm. It was thick enough to touch, and when Mikhail hit it, it was like running into a wall. He bounced backward, his body hitting the hard stones. The breath was knocked from him. When he tried to stand, the fog remained solid, impenetrable. 12 figures emerged from the houses. They wore the clothes of the villagers, Sunday suits and floral dresses and cardigans that Mikhail recognized from the people he'd known his whole life. But where their faces should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No features, no individuality, just blank expansion of epidermis where humanity should have been. They moved forward in perfect synchronization. Their movements matched to each other like a dance they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. The lanterns in their hands were filled with the same black fog, and the light they cast was sickly and wrong. Mikhail looked toward the great oak. The tree was glowing now, a pulsing red light emanating from its core. The ground was shaking. The heartbeat had returned, but it was no longer a distant sound. It was a roar, a deafening, subsonic frequency that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ledger was heavy in his hands. His knuckles had bled from gripping it so tightly, and the blood had soaked into the leather. The weeping eye on the cover seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat of the tree. He held it to his chest as the figures moved in closer. Their movements were synchronized, their breathing collective and wet, like the sound of a single organism made of many parts. And then he saw Ivan among them. Ivan's face was halfway transitioned. One eye was gone, replaced by smooth skin, and his mouth was sewn shut with silver thread. He stood perfectly still, perfectly upright, perfectly wrong. Mikhail fell to his knees. The flare was in his jacket pocket. He'd grabbed it on the way out of the house, a fragment of rational thought in a sea of panic. Now his fingers found it, and he struck it against the stone. The brilliant red fire ignited with a hiss. The entity screamed. The sound wasn't a scream exactly. It was a collective shriek that seemed to come from deep within the earth, a sound of agony and rage, and something that might have been hunger. They fell back into the darkness, their gray forms dissolving into shadow. The keeper stepped from the trunk of the oak. It was a giant made of bark and bone, animated by something that had never been human. Its skin was the color of charred wood, and its limbs were thick as tree trunks. When it moved with a terrible, inexorable purpose. It swung its fist. The movement was slow enough to see, but too fast to dodge. The fist connected with Mikhail's chest, and he felt ribs crack. The pain was white-hot, all-consuming. He was lifted off the ground and thrown across the clearing, landing among the roots of the tree with enough force to drive the wind from his lungs. But he was still alive. He was still moving. He could still hold the flare. He drove it into a fissure in the giant's leg. The bark caught fire instantly. The flames were orange and red, climbing quickly up the creature's frame. It bellowed, a sound like an earthquake, like the death of mountains. And Mikhail used the distraction to crawl toward the base of the tree. His fingers found the lighter in his pocket. It was an old Zippo, his grandfather's, with the initials AV etched into the case. He'd been carrying it for years, never smoking, just carrying it because it had always been there. Now his fingers fumbled with the flint. Click, click, click. The lighter would not ignite. The keeper was looming over him, its arm raised for a killing blow, and the shadow it cast was absolute. Click. The flame caught. Mikhail touched it to the ledger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ancient paper exploded into blue flames. Impossible flames that burned with a color that had no name. The symbols on the cover curled and turned to white ash, and the ash began to rise into the air in a perfect spiral. The keeper froze mid-strike. The roar stopped. The heartbeat stopped. For a moment, there was only the soft crackle of the burning book and the sound of ash falling like snow. Then the giant began to crumble. The bark fell away, revealing not bone beneath, but only emptiness. The figure collapsed into a pile of charred wood and ash. The red light from the great oak faded, and the tree itself seemed to shrink, to compress, to die. The wind picked up, and the featureless figures crumbled into gray dust that scattered across the village square. The fog began to thin, to dissipate, to become something other than a wall between the world and this place. Mikhail was alone. The last of the leather cover turned to white ash. The weeping eye symbol curled like paper in a fire, the delicate lines dissolving into nothing. Mikhail watched it burn, watched the blue flames consume the last physical remnant of the Pact, watched the ash rise and scatter on the wind. Around him, the village was dissolving. The featureless figures crumbled into their component parts, Sunday clothes falling empty to the cobblestones, collapsing into piles of fabric and dust. The gray dust that had once been skin rose in small clouds that caught the fading light and turned into gold for a moment before dispersing entirely. He found Ivan's clothing near the well. The shirt and the trousers he'd been wearing were intact, laid out on the stones as if he'd simply stepped out of them and walked away. But there was nothing inside. No body, no trace of anything human. Only the locket remained, lying on top of the pile, snapped open by the force of whatever had taken him. Inside, where the photograph should have been, nothing. Only the empty metal case and the impression of where the photo had been pressed for decades. Mikhail pressed his head against the scorched bark of the great oak. The tree was dead. He could feel it, could sense the absence of the heartbeat that had animated it for so long. The leaves were turning to dust, falling in a single gust of wind that scattered them across the village square like memories that couldn't quite be held. The horizon showed a thin line of pale gray dawn. The night had been impossibly long, but it was ending. The world was coming back. He picked up a handful of the ledger's ash. When he opened his fingers, it didn't fall. It stayed suspended in the air, swirling in a tiny, permanent vortex that hovered above his palm. The ash particles were glowing with a faint, dying ember light, and they moved in a circular pattern that seemed to respond to no wind, to no external force. A light that was still alive, that would always be alive. Mikhail walked down the main road, away from the tree. His shadow was long and thin in the early morning light. He didn't look back. He reached the spot where the root wall had been, where the barrier had blocked his escape just hours before. The roots were gone. The scars they'd left in the earth were deep and dark, but the barrier itself had vanished. The road stretched ahead toward the horizon, open and clear. He crossed the threshold. Nothing changed. The scenery remained identical to what it had been before. The same broken truck sat by the side of the road, its windshield shattered, its tires flat. The same dirt and gravel stretched ahead. The sun seemed stuck in a permanent state of setting, hanging low on the horizon, neither rising nor falling. Mikhail turned and ran. His lungs screamed. His feet pounded against the earth, one after another, each impact sending jolts through his damaged ribs. He ran until his vision blurred, until his legs nearly gave out beneath him. Until he rounded a corner and found himself standing exactly in front of the great oak again. His footprints from earlier were still fresh in the mud. The heartbeat had returned, faint but growing stronger. The fog began to rise from the ground. It wasn't white or black anymore, but a thick, pulsating gray. It smelled of wet earth and old paper and something else, something organic and ancient. The first faint thump-thump echoed through the square. Mikhail looked at his hands. The skin was beginning to smooth over. His fingernails were disappearing, sinking back into the flesh like they were being absorbed. The texture of his palms was becoming uniform, losing all the lines and whorls and imperfections that made them uniquely his. He tried to scream, but his mouth was being sealed by skin. The sound came out as a muffled groan that no one could hear. No one would ever hear. The eyes were the last thing to remain. He could see them in the window of the house nearby, could watch as they began to fade, to be replaced by the blank smoothness that had taken everyone else. He tried to move toward the window, tried to see his own face one last time before it disappeared. But his legs no longer responded to his intention. They simply stood there, rooted, as the skin expanded across his eye sockets. The fog rolled in thicker. The great oak stood in the center of the village, silent and permanent. The town stretched out around it in a perfect circle, and every window was empty. Every street was empty. The gray dust that remained was all that was left of the people. A single drop of thick red sap fell from a charred branch. It hit the ground, and the sound rippled through the air, a sharp, clear thump that echoed from the earth itself. The sap was the color of fresh arterial blood, steaming slightly in the cool morning air. Inside the trunk, something was happening. Wood fibers were weaving together, moving with intention and purpose. But they were not forming wood. They were forming white rectangular sheets of parchment. The fibers moved through each other like hands, interlocking, creating the structure of pages. Page after page, forming from the biological material of the tree itself. A name appeared on the first page. It was written in fresh, wet ink. Red ink that looked exactly like blood. The letters formed themselves in real time, the unseen quill moving across the parchment with practiced precision. Volkov. Another name appeared below it. Petrov. And beside these names, the dates. 2074. 50 years from now. 50 years from the previous cycle. 50 years until the debt would call again. The camera pans up to a branch that extends from the crown of the oak. Hanging from it, suspended by a thin iron chain, is a small brass locket. It sways in the breeze. In the silence of the dead village, its movement is almost musical, almost a celebration. The locket swings. Once, twice, 3 times. And then it swings open. Inside is a photograph. The image shows 2 figures, but their faces are featureless silhouettes. Mikhail and Ivan, or what had been Mikhail and Ivan. The rest of the photograph is blank, untouched by time. On the locket's face, engraved with deliberate precision, is the weeping eye symbol. The heartbeat echoes through the silence of the empty village, growing stronger with each pulse. The rhythm is perfect. The rhythm is patient. The rhythm is eternal. Thump, thump, thump. The dawn light fades. The sun disappears. The fog rolls in, thicker than before, darker than before, more real than before. And in the trunk of the great oak, the ledger takes shape, page by page, name by name, generation by generation. It will be found, as it was always meant to be found. It will be read, as it was always meant to be read. The cycle will continue, as it has always continued, as it always will. Thump, thump, thump. The locket swings in the darkness, and the weeping eye watches everything with patient, eternal hunger.